What is the optimal human diet? Is carnivore, vegan, something in between? We are diving headfirst into the diet wars. And I'm going to come clean about something. Although I'm a huge fan of the work of people like Dr. Weston A. a name often invoked in the defense of animal-based diets and debunking plant-based diets, me personally, I'm primarily a plant-based guy. I know. How do you square that circle? If you have ever had questions regarding the optimal human diet, ever grappled with the ethics of eating meat, the scientific evidence that supports a plant-based lifestyle, or the health transformations that are all over social media from those following a carnivore diet, this episode is for you. Unlike most conversations on this topic, I'm not here to take sides. In fact, I think that both sides are focused on the wrong enemy. Join me in entertaining the possibility that it is time to end the diet wars and enter into a new golden age of human health and vitality. Welcome to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel, a podcast in which we explore what it takes to reclaim radical health and fitness, build an unstoppable mindset, and create your most unlimited and unconditional life. Today we're talking diet wars. What is the optimal human diet? Is it carnivore? Is it vegan? Or is it something else? Is it time to end this discussion once and for all and set our sights on a new enemy? And I will tell you, if you've seen debates on this topic or feel that you have a fairly informed opinion on the matter, stick around. This isn't what you think. Trust me. We are going to talk my own personal evolution. We're going to talk one of the most influential documentaries on plant-based diets, a critical debate hosted by Joe Rogan. We're going to talk Dr. Paul Saladino, Dr. Weston A. Chris Kresser, James Wilks. The list goes on. And as you know, I'm not a surface-level guy. I want to go deep into these subjects and get toward the truth. Are we there yet? I don't know. But we're going to learn a lot, and we're going to have a lot of fun along the way. Now, I've said this before, but I am constantly amazed by how often the personal drives the professional in stories of scientific, medical, and technological innovation. We are taught to believe that science, quote unquote, is objective. It's non-personal. Lay people like you and me, we may be prone to latching onto anecdotal stories, but not scientists. No. They let the data dispassionately lead them toward an ever-improving understanding of the truth. In absence of emotion, they just sort of levitate on a cloud off in a university lab somewhere. Now, of course, I'm being a little bit funny here, but you get my point, right? You've been exposed to this idea as well. But as I've been fascinated by this space for some time, I am constantly amazed by how often stories of innovation or great scientific discovery start with a personal anecdote or a personal challenge or experience that was sort of the spark that pointed the scientist or researcher or doctor to look in a certain direction. Way back in episode 1, we discussed the absolutely incredible story of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, the man who is credited with the discovery of the importance of hand washing in a medical setting in general, but within the context of childbirth specifically. Now, if you haven't listened to that episode, or if you are unfamiliar with the story, you're going to want to go back and give it a listen. It is absolutely insane. But very quickly, a mystery illness was killing 1 in 3 pregnant women at one of the largest and most prestigious hospitals in Europe in the 1800s. And no one could figure it out. And this hospital wasn't alone. Other hospitals in Germany, France, even the United States and Canada were experiencing similar tragedies. And this goes on for decades until a young immigrant doctor by the name of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis determines the cause of the mystery disease, a means of preventing the disease, and he does it all on the first attempt. A perfect trifecta, all before his 30th birthday. As unbelievable and crazy as that would be, the craziest part is what happens next. Is he awarded a Nobel Prize? A tenured position at a leading university? No, none of that. He is pushed out of his position, and he is found dead a few years later in an insane asylum. Yeah, I know. Insane. Like I said, if you haven't heard the story, go all the way back to episode 1 and remedy that. And when you do, keep in mind, this is the very first episode. So the sound quality, the production quality, not quite the same as where we are today, but it is still a phenomenal episode and a story that everyone should know. Now, why do I bring this up? Because even at the core of the Semmelweis story is a story of personal tragedy. It is seeing the death of a friend and colleague who dies in a manner similar to the pregnant women that Semmelweis is concerned with. That is the eureka moment. It is the light bulb that enables this young doctor to make the connection and determine what is killing these pregnant women. And we've discussed the work of Dr. Weston A. Price a few times on this channel, so I'll just say this. If that name is new to you, welcome. I'm very glad to have you. But go back and check out episodes 2, episodes 3. I've said it before, but I do believe that Dr. Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration is the most important book written on nutrition and human health ever. Full stop. Never to be replicated. Just amazing. An absolute must read. But at the core of his story, of his aha moment, which led him to consider the possibility that the rise in dental cavities and degenerative diseases in the United States in the 1920s and 30s was not due to the result of genetic factors, poor dental hygiene, but it was the result of a decline in nutrition. That the emergence of modern processed foods such as white flours, sugars, jams, vegetable oils, as a substitute for traditional, natural, nutrient-dense, what we today would call whole foods, right? Just real foods, was actually the cause of the issue. And wherever this switch was happening, whether in the continental United States, up in Alaska, the Swiss Alps, or sub-Saharan Africa, the results were exactly the same. A rise in degenerative disease and a sharp decline in the health and vitality of the people involved. But in order for Price to see this clearly, to buck the consensus of his peers and the conventional thinking of the time, it was a personal experience. First, his own experience in overcoming typhoid fever and essentially being nursed back to health by his uncle in Western Canada, sort of living wild, hunting small game, foraging for berries and fishing for salmon, as well as the tragic death of his own teenage son, who died from complications of a root canal performed by Dr. Weston A. Price himself. Yeah, I know. Again, the personal drives the professional. And we don't have to go back 100 years to see this in action. Dr. Paul Saladino, a.k.a. Carnivore MD, who we're going to discuss a bit today. What was at the core of his consideration of a radical change to an all-animal-based diet? Personal health challenges. It wasn't books he read in medical school. It wasn't something that he taught. It wasn't something that he was taught in his residency program. It was personal. Dr. Catherine Shanahan, her awakening to the potential dangers of seed oils. The start of it? Personal. Dr. Stephen Gundry, his consideration of the dangers of lectins. The start of it? Personal. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. The view of scientific and medical discovery that we're presented with, I have found is often simply not true. That not surprisingly, people are people. Whether they are wearing a lab coat or a pair of welding overalls, they are prone to personal bias, they are prone to follow a hunch, they are prone to being human. And this is incredibly important to keep in mind for this topic. How we eat is highly personal. The intensity of the debate around this topic is kind of odd. Why does it matter how another person eats? And I'm not talking about friends and family here, people we might actually see, we might actually interact with. But the other 8 billion people, why do we care? Now, of course, I'm not being naive here. I know that embedded within this conversation are implications for the planet, for animal welfare, and for the global economy, for the health of future generations. But it still is a bit odd. And of course, I'm guilty of this as well. Probably more so than most now that I've decided to publicly weigh in on this through a podcast. And what led me to this point? What led me to dedicate my time, my effort, my energy to attempting to wrap my head around questions like, how should I eat? What foods are likely health promoting? What foods are likely problematic? Well, you guessed it. It was personal. In episode 10, I shared a bit about my personal story, weight gain, and weight loss, all without the use of injectable weight loss drugs. Through diet and lifestyle change, I was able to drop about 40 pounds and go from being obese and inflamed to lean, muscular, and in probably the best shape of my life. But what I didn't share in that episode was that part of what made that possible, one of the key changes that I made, was that I stopped eating meat. I became a vegetarian, and eventually, for a short time, I became a vegan. And I will say this right from the start, as a vegetarian, my health outcomes improved. As I discussed in our last episode, I had terrible seasonal allergies as a kid. And even into my adult life, I snored. I had sleep apnea. And for months out of the year, both in upstate New York and eventually in North Carolina, I was just miserable. Runny nose, watery eyes, mouth breathing, just awful. But in college one year, I decided to give up meat for Lent. Not just on Fridays, which is sort of the minimum, but I decided to give it up for the full 40 days. And the crazy thing is that my allergies, my runny nose, watery eyes, my mouth breathing, it all went away. Now, if you've suffered from seasonal allergies, I don't have to convince you of the significance of this. Liberating. Absolutely liberating. Now, I did go back to eating meat after Lent for two reasons. First, well, because I liked it, and there was no ethical consideration for me in this moment. Most of my favorite foods involved meat, whether it was chicken or beef, and it would have been difficult socially for me. As terrible as living with seasonal allergies was, the prospect of giving up some of my favorite foods and becoming a bit of a social pariah was clearly worse to me at the time. Now, after college, I gained weight steadily, consistently. I worked in the corporate world. I had more money, access to nicer restaurants, tastier foods, travel, booze, all the things. And while I still worked out pretty religiously, in about 5 years, I managed to put on almost 50 pounds. To be honest, I don't know if there was a single moment when I said, whoa, I got to turn this around. If there was, I don't remember. And keep in mind, this is also maybe the high watermark of the popularity of plant-based diets. Books like How Not to Die by Dr. Michael Greger, documentaries like The Game Changers and What the Health. I think it's safe to say that 15 years ago, if you were considering, quote, getting healthy, cutting meat and animal products out of your diet would have been one of the first things you considered. Maybe carbs too, and certainly the low-carb movement, the keto movement, paleo for sure. Yeah, those were all things. But since the, quote, debunking of the Atkins diet back in like the 90s, a key pillar of most of the expert dietary advice was reducing meat consumption. In many ways, a few powerful experiences shaped my thinking around diet and nutrition. First, I'd had this experience back in college. Second, I now managed to lose a substantial amount of weight, going from obese to normal weight, to lean and ripped. I looked good and I felt good. And third of all the experts, quote unquote, told me that I was right, that plant-based was the way to go for everybody. Did I do some evangelizing? I'm sure I did. But mostly if people asked me how I ate, I'd just tell them. And because I came to plant-based for personal reasons rather than ethical or environmental reasons, I honestly never really felt the same pressure to convince other people to join me. I knew that my experience was personal, the approach effective, and while I did believe that a plant-based lifestyle was probably healthier than not, I could also see that there were clearly people for whom a plant-based or a vegan lifestyle was definitely encouraging consumption of pretty terrible foods. So in an episode in which we're discussing the short-sightedness of the diet wars, the dangers of, quote, picking a side, of plant-based versus animal-based, vegan versus carnivore, pick whatever your dietary pattern A is versus dietary pattern B, I have two confessions to make. First, I was never a full-on warrior for the plant-based cause. Secondly, and what may come as a surprise to people, given my love of the work of Dr. Weston A. I still am primarily plant-based. Now, for some people, that's enough for them to just hit the stop button, unsubscribe, right? Add my name to a list of plant-based industry shills. I know. Like I said, I've been there. And of course, that is part of the why for this episode. My thinking on the subject has evolved and continues to evolve. And because I see many people making the same mistake that I believe that I made, aligning with a camp, sticking with a camp, and then assuming that the rest of the world would be better off if they did the same, I'll say this episode might serve you. Now, there are 3 things that evolved my thinking more so than anything. And these changes took place over a period of years, but they got me to a place that I believe has been much, much better for me, much healthier for me socially also, but I believe much closer to the truth of understanding the quote optimal human diet, or at least some aspects of the optimal human diet. And we're going to talk about these big 3 events, these 3 episodes that opened my eyes to the idea that the diet wars, that this argument of plant-based versus animal-based, that it's really just missing the mark. And we'll go into each of them, but in short, they are 1, a debate hosted by Joe Rogan between James Wilkes and Chris Kresser. 2, seeing a very public, potentially embarrassing turnaround by a leading carnivore MD. And 3, reading and rereading the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. So as I said, we're going to talk about all 3 of those. Let's get into it. Do you remember a documentary called The Game Changers? It was a documentary that came out in 2018, made by a guy named James Wilkes. And for those who don't know the name, James Wilkes was a professional mixed martial artist and UFC fighter. And this documentary, The Game Changers, investigated vegan athletes from fighters to powerlifters to football players to bodybuilders. Many, many people saw the documentary. And as someone who was plant-based at the time, many people talked to me about the documentary. And I know a few people personally who came to become plant-based after watching the film. Now, this is 2018. As I've said, this is probably close to the high watermark of the plant-based movement, at least in my lifetime. But not everyone was convinced, right? Already there were people questioning the quote-unquote scientific consensus around the benefit of reducing our consumption of animal-based foods, both from a human health perspective as well as from an environmental and planetary perspective. This is around the time I first started hearing about this odd group of people who had the completely opposite view, that not only was meat not bad for you, not something you should attempt to eat in moderation or reduce where you can, but something incredibly healthy for you, maybe among the healthiest foods you could consume. And not only that, but that plants might actually be the enemy. Rather than being full of antioxidants, phytochemicals, and health-promoting nutrients, they are actually masters of long-running chemical warfare, full of plant-based toxins like lectins, oxalates, and anti-nutrients, designed to deter their consumption, not to nobly serve the animal kingdom at the bottom of the trophic sphere. One prominent carnivore MD famously called fruit something like the, quote, pornography of the plant-based kingdom, end quote, designed to draw us in, use our own natural drives against us, and leave us ultimately unsatisfied and worse for the experience. And again, this was just incredible to me. Black is white, up is down. In many ways, this was an incredible time from the perspective of human health and nutrition because you started seeing real debates on these topics. Plant versus animal-based. Consensus science versus heretical science. Just incredible. And one such debate that really evolved my thinking was a conversation between James Wilkes, the filmmaker behind The Game Changers, and Chris Kresser on the Joe Rogan Experience. The lead up to this debate is important. I've been a fan of documentaries for a long time, but this documentary, The Game Changers, was completely different. It had people who had never watched documentaries checking it out. It had people who were squarely in the camp of the standard American diet, thinking about health in general and the potential benefits of a plant-based lifestyle specifically. Chris Kresser is a functional health practitioner, a podcaster, who I guess you could say is an advocate of a mixed diet. In each case, as I've pointed out before, at the core of each of these men's story is a personal story of dealing with health challenges, attempting to make dietary changes in their lives, discovering something that worked, and then sharing that with the world. The personal drives the professional. This is not a bug, it is a feature. But as I've mentioned, Game Changers was controversial. Many people took issue with the film. But Chris Kresser, on Joe Rogan's show, leveled some critiques at some of the points of the film. Well, James Wilkes is a fighter. I guess you could say that he did what fighters do. He fought back, challenging Kresser to a debate. And to his credit, Kresser agreed to return to the Joe Rogan experience and sit across from James Wilkes and discuss the film. If you haven't seen that debate, I'd highly recommend it. It's probably been a few years since I saw it, but at the time of me watching it, I'm primarily plant-based, probably something like a dairy-free vegetarian with the occasional pescatarian meal. If you were going to make an assumption about whose side I'd be on in this debate, it would be James Wilkes. But that's not what happens. If I recall correctly, both the internet and I believe even Joe Rogan himself seem to sort of have James Wilkes as having won the debate. James is passionate, he's fired up, he's prepared, and he is out for blood. You can tell. His reputation is on the line. And occasionally throughout the debate, he checks in with Rogan, asking things like, "How we doing, Joe?" And Rogan, I think at one point even says to him something like, "Yeah, that's a home run," or "You nailed it," when Wilkes makes a very salient point. And Kresser is sort of cowed. If body language alone tells the story here, Kresser is defeated. Wilkes has gone point by point, backing the claims made in the film, and Kresser even retracts a few points that he made in the earlier episode. And while I think it's fair to say that most, including Rogan at the time, would have given the debate to Wilkes, and maybe even he did win, there are a few things about the discussion that at the time just really stuck in my mind. And I'm not alone on this. A primary point that Wilkes returns to again and again is the weight of the scientific evidence, the number of studies, the experts who back his view, the World Health Organization, etc., the doctors, the specialists, the people who should know better than us, and according to many, do know better than us. And Kresser doesn't let this slide. He pushes back appropriately. He points out the flaws of the epidemiological studies, especially with respect to nutrition, and the fact that simply because many people, no matter how qualified, believe something to be true, that doesn't necessarily make it so. This is a fallacy. It's argument from authority. Kresser attempts to make his case logically, dispassionately, to engage in proper debate. No ad hominem attacks, no logical fallacies. And whether it is out of malice or inexperience, Wilkes does not constrain himself. Ad hominem attacks, logical fallacies, all fair game, all employed in service of his cause, and the contrast is incredible. Whereas Kresser is soft-spoken and deliberate, Wilkes is fired up and passionate. Kresser is open to the possibility that he's wrong, where Wilkes is confident that his answer is right. Kresser has come for a debate, Wilkes for a fight, one he is intent on winning, and it would appear that he does. It is impressive, it is effective, but is it correct? As a student of rhetoric, of argumentation and debate, one who has been warned about the dangers of logical fallacies, not because they are ineffective in a debate, but because they may sacrifice the truth in the pursuit of winning. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't sit right with me. Not only that, but as a student of nutrition and human health, I've never been satisfied with, quote, being right, but with gaining some insights into the truth. And there is something in that calm, deliberate case attempted by Kresser that was absolutely steamrolled by Wilkes that sits with me, and I start to wonder. The next important change was actually sitting down to read the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. As discussed, I've done 2 full-length episodes on the work of Dr. Weston A. Price in his book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. They are earlier episodes, so keep that in mind and grade on a curve with respect to audio quality, production value, etc. But I do believe that those are among the most definitive discussions and reviews of the work of Dr. Weston A. Price that you will find on the internet. Now, I had heard about the work of Dr. Weston A. Price for years before finally deciding that I needed to read his work for myself. And like many, I'd heard Dr. Price's name in the context of certain foods, certain health trends like bone broth, raw milk, and the importance of eating animal-based foods, as well as biological dentistry. And like many things within the health space, what I found was often presented as the conclusions of Dr. Price's work, or the key takeaways from his findings, was incomplete. And like many people, when I read Price's work and saw the hundreds, if not thousands, of photos that are presented in his incredible book, I was blown away by the absolute health and vitality of those following a natural whole foods diet. This is the most important book ever written on human health and nutrition. I firmly believe that. And keep in mind, I was plant-based at the time, and I am primarily plant-based now. Dr. Weston A. Price was no fan of plant-based diets, and I knew this before I read his work. Price's name is often invoked in, quote, debunking plant-based and vegan diets. So why was I reading Dr. Weston A. Price? Because as I've discussed a few times on this channel, I've seen the nutrition world do a complete 180 several times in my relatively short life. From the food pyramid to low-carb diets to the dangers of consuming fruit, etc. If I am wrong on a subject, I'd rather know as quickly as possible. And I've made the mistake of not keeping an open mind on a subject in the past, only to realize much later that I've made a mistake. It is never a problem to be wrong. It is only a problem to stay wrong. I'm not perfect on this, of course, but I do try to keep an open mind to ideas that challenge my thinking. I try to seek those ideas out. And the work of Dr. Weston A. Price definitely challenged my thinking on this. It is very clear from the work of Price that there have been many people, many peoples throughout human history across many places, cultures, and varying genetic stock that have consumed animal-based foods and have enjoyed incredibly high standards of health and vitality. Now, that statement probably seems much less controversial to say today, but again, this is the heyday of the plant-based movement, and there is a lot of momentum behind the idea that many, if not all of our modern health issues, ranging from heart disease to obesity to type 2 diabetes, stem from our consumption of meat and animal-based foods in the developed world. In the work of Dr. Price, I believe definitively points to the fact that this could not possibly be true. Every society featured in the work of Dr. Price consumes animal foods to some degree, and some to varying high degrees. And none of them suffer in the way that our modern society suffers today, or as the modern society of the 1930s suffered. Okay, interesting, but that begs the obvious question. Did I incorporate meat, beef, chicken, pork, etc. back into my diet? No, I didn't. And we'll get into why. We're going to talk about what Price actually said with respect to plant-based diets, and we're going to talk about why most summaries of Price's findings are incomplete. If you like Dr. Weston A. Price and you fall into the conventional understanding of his views, this may surprise you, this may annoy you, this may piss you off, but it is true, so we're going to proceed. So plant-based diets. Dr. Weston A. Price does explicitly address the issue of plant-based diets in his book. In a more than 500-page book, Dr. Price explicitly discusses plant-based diets precisely twice. 2 times in 500 pages. In both times, he makes almost the same statement, which is something to the effect of, I have not found a group of people building and maintaining good bodies exclusively using plant-based foods. And for many people, they've taken these 2 statements, or the same statement essentially said twice, as the definitive proof that plant-based diets had no place in traditional societies and that Dr. Weston A. Price's work debunks plant-based diets. But these statements are not the slam dunk that they appear to be. First, These are mere assertions. Okay, there is no evidence, no proof provided. Not necessarily saying that Price is wrong about this. It's just that the case that has been presented is so incredibly weak that if we are to accept it, we are accepting it on faith. Now, we can take this statement to mean one of two things. Either that he looked to find people living on plant-based foods in traditional cultures and couldn't find any, or it could mean that he did find people living exclusively on plant-based foods, and those people lacked vitality, had poor physical development, etc. Now, this is a significant difference, as the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Okay, that's an important point. And what evidence does Price provide to back up this important claim? As I mentioned, in short, nothing. No photos, no names of groups, no discussions that he's had, just nothing. Zip, nada. And I do mean that. I did look. And again, look for yourself. The only thing that comes close is that he makes reference to some modern plant-based advocates. And again, this is modern in the context of the 1930s. And that the results in this case have been less impressive. Again, though, the case here is incredibly weak. Okay, I'm being generous here. There's just nothing there. He doesn't name the people. He doesn't name the groups involved. He doesn't offer a single photo. Just nothing. It is just incredibly, incredibly weak. It is an assertion without an argument. It is a claim without evidence, without logic. Okay, it is not an argument. And even if what Price is saying is true, he makes mention of the fact that this is an entirely modern phenomenon. So it is highly likely that those following a, quote, plant-based diet in Dr. Price's day were suffering from all of the same issues, nutritional deficiencies, etc., of those following a, quote, modern diet of the 1930s that included both plant-based and animal-based foods. If that is true, and we have great reason to suspect that it is, even if Price's assertion is correct, is this an issue of a lack of animal-based foods? Or is the issue the same modern, processed, nutritionally void foods of the 1930s? The white flours, the seed oils, the canned vegetables that Dr. Price so eloquently eviscerates. And if you're inclined to agree with Dr. Price in this case, let's consider the opposite. Suppose a prominent vegan doctor made a similar claim regarding something like cancer, and suppose that doctor attempted to find people who had experienced little or no cancer in their 60s and 70s. And suppose that doctor discovered that many of those people consumed diets that were very high in plant-based foods. And then that doctor went on to make the claim that he or she had found no evidence of those following an exclusively animal-based diet who remained cancer-free in their 60s and 70s. And that was the end of the statement. No additional proof provided. I think it would be fair to say that the questions regarding the statement would be quite obvious. Did you actually find any people in their 60s and 70s who had been following an exclusively animal-based diet? If so, what type of animal-based diet had they been following? Were they consuming organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised meats? Or did their diets consist of highly processed meats coming from animals pumped full of antibiotics, growth hormone, and being fed corn and other inflammatory grains? We would have more questions than answers because there would be nothing behind the statement. And that is the case here. While we may like or dislike the statement Dr. Price makes with respect to plant-based diets, if we assess the statement as objectively as we possibly can, there isn't much there. Second, I have to point out that I see a consistent misunderstanding in Dr. Weston A. Price's work. And again, I'm not saying it's intentional here, but I don't believe I've ever seen it corrected. But Dr. Price's work is split into two parts. So first, he travels around the world in the 1930s, studying people of a similar genetic stock, but who are following two divergent diets, some on a modern processed diet, and modern in the context of the 1930s, and then those on a traditional, what we could probably describe today very succinctly as a whole foods diet. The way their parents ate, their grandparents ate, who knows for how long, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And what Price does find is remarkable Everywhere he goes, it's the same story. Those following their traditional diets have phenomenal health. Those on the modern diets, it's a disaster. But to Price's credit, he doesn't just sit on the sideline, write books and articles. He attempts to create what I've described as an intervention diet. Now, he doesn't use that word explicitly, but that is what it is. It is an intervention diet that can be used in places like the United States, Canada, and Europe in the modern setting of the 1930s. Okay, now this is hugely important. The foods that Price uses and includes in his intervention diet: bone broth, whole milk, grass-fed butter, bread baked from freshly ground whole wheat berries, cod liver oil. These are not foods that Price discovered people following a traditional diet consuming in large quantities. Okay, this is hugely important. Take cod liver oil, for example, something that is commonly associated with Dr. Weston A. Price and is part of the, quote, Dr. Weston A. Price diet. Now, how many groups from Price's travels consumed cod liver oil? None. Not one. Zero. Zip. Okay? How about grass-fed butter? And the answer here is just one. One group living in the Swiss Alps. Now, there's an important reason for this. The foods that are commonly understood to be part of Dr. Weston A. Price's, quote, diet, I'm using quotes very liberally here, are not Price's ideal list of foods for human beings to build and maintain optimal bodies. They are, very simply put, a utilitarian blend of foods that can provide as many of the important nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, the important fat-soluble vitamins that Price has assessed as common in many traditional diets, like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K2, adapted for the modern setting of the 1930s in places like the United States, Canada, and Europe. This is hugely important. This is not an ideal diet. This is a diet that has been designed to serve the greatest possible number, cheaply, effectively, with limited refrigeration, limited access to foods, limited access to global supply chains in the modern context of the 1930s. Full stop. And this isn't me saying it. This is Price. Price is very clear about this. He does say it explicitly. This was never designed to be an optimal human diet. In the context we are living in, with access to global food chains, unprecedented access to fresh foods and seafoods, hint, hint, even if we don't live near the water, is incredibly different. It's a very different setting. So, what would be included in Price's optimal diet? Well, as I hinted at, it would be seafood. Okay, very, very clearly, Price has incredibly high praise for every single group on a traditional diet. But there is no doubt in my mind that the highest praise is reserved for those eating a diet that contains seafoods, both sea animals and sea vegetables. We went through many of the direct quotes where Price says as much previously, so we'll hold off today. But it is a real tragedy that this is missed in so many summaries of Price's work. This is critically important, and many people are missing it. This is not a distinction without a difference here. We are living in an incredibly different time than Dr. Weston A. Price. And if we blindly follow the intervention diet that was designed by Price for a wide swath of the population in the United States in the 1930s, we are completely missing the boat. We are completely missing the observations, the opportunity to really aim at something much more optimal from a human health perspective. What Dr. Weston A. Price presents in his book here is a much more nuanced view into the world of food, nutrient density, and the incredible variety in eating patterns that can sustain human health and vitality. Now, if you think I'm picking on the plant-based side a bit, this one is for you. People who advocate for plant-based eating as a healthy lifestyle are certainly not the only ones prone to bias, logical fallacies, or extrapolating from anecdotes. We're all guilty of it, as I've said. I've certainly done it as well, so I'm not throwing stones from my glass house. But the third, truly eye-opening moment for me on this subject comes from the very public reversal of Dr. Paul Saladino. For those who don't know, Dr. Paul Saladino rose to prominence a few years ago as the, quote, Carnivore MD. I believe that even still is his handle on social media today. I don't remember exactly when I first heard his name, but Dr. Paul is a medical doctor who, again, wound up seriously questioning the conventional dietary advice when he attempted to solve a number of chronic health conditions that he personally was suffering from: eczema, weight gain, possibly a few others. Now, it's been a since I've gone back to his sort of origin story, so to speak. But Saladino eventually somehow gets to the carnivore diet. And lo and behold, many of his health issues resolve. And I should point out that carnivore wasn't his first stop in attempting to let food be thy medicine. At one point in time, he was vegan. I believe he even tried other elimination diets. Now, this story probably sounds familiar to you, because the themes are so common in almost any story of natural healing. Many failed attempts, finding something unconventional that works, becoming a true believer, and an evangelist. And Saladino was and remains a very strong advocate for animal-based diets. I saw him debate famous vegan doctors like Dr. Joel Fuhrman. And I'll say this, it wasn't pretty for the plant-based side. Unlike many who publicly debate these topics, Saladino has clearly been schooled in debate. He's really quite good. Even as someone largely consuming a plant-based diet, I've listened to Saladino on and off for years as a challenge to my own thinking, a worthy opponent, so to speak, to keep me honest and ensure that I'm seeking truth rather than confirmation. And as I've mentioned earlier, one of the key issues that animal-based carnivore diet community has raised is around the issue of plant toxins. They're not the only ones. Dr. Stephen Gundry, the author of The Plant Paradox, a book I really enjoyed, is probably best known for sounding the alarm on lectins. These are small plant proteins, which Gundry and others argue disrupt our microbiome and lead to a host of other metabolic and chronic conditions. And in what was sort of a funny discussion, I don't know, maybe it was a debate, Saladino sat down with the very famous Dr. Stephen Gundry, right? He's treated all sorts of celebrities. And in this conversation, Saladino sort of out-Gundrys Stephen Gundry, right? Saladino points out that lectins are far from the only plant compound that could be described as having a potentially toxic effect. And it was a very interesting discussion. Not only that, plants contain sugars. Let's set aside even starches like corn, white rice, white potatoes, but even fruit. Fruit has become this incredibly controversial food within the carnivore and keto community for its potential role in raising blood sugar. As, quote, Carnivore MD, Saladino is the guy who famously said that fruit is something like the pornography of the plant kingdom, or something to that effect. That fruit is enticing not because we're supposed to eat it, but that it's sort of nature's trick designed to get us to eat something that's not good for us so that we unwittingly spread the seeds, thus acting as pawns in the plot of some nefarious plant. But Saladino then also did something which very, very few public health and wellness voices would be willing to do. He started sharing his own blood work. He did this as sort of a defense against the claims that his detractors would make. The arguments that his diet would certainly have an impact on cholesterol, blood pressure, fasting glucose, and he started posting his results and was open and started discussing them. And this was incredible for two reasons. First, because he brought the receipts. He didn't just say it. He showed it. And like I said, this is incredible. But the other reason this was incredible is that it set him up for a very public and potentially humiliating reversal on the consumption of carbohydrates. And from what I recall, it didn't come from the plant-based community. It wasn't vegans or frugivores or medical doctors who convinced Saladino that his position on carbohydrates wasn't correct. It was bodybuilders. And Saladino, this sort of rising star, this incredible voice within the carnivore community, out bashing fruit, it was a few guys within the bodybuilding community, and I believe it was guys like Derek from More Plates, More Dates, who predicted and explained some things that were off with Saladino's testosterone levels, and those were directly tied to sustained carbohydrate restriction. And also incredibly, Saladino, a medical doctor, he listened to a bunch of gym bros. If that isn't just such an example of the incredible time we're living in from the perspective of human health, I don't know what is. But this really, really stood out to me. Here was this guy who could have very easily buried it. He could have made the change privately or not. He had all the reason in the world to avoid this new and uncomfortable truth. But he didn't. He did what is so difficult for so many people to do, especially publicly. He changed his mind, and he did it plainly and directly. Did this upset some people within the carnivore community? In the keto community? Sure, of course. But it stood out to me not for the content of the change or even the direction of the change, but just the fact that he did change. That you can and maybe should not fit neatly into a box. That while it may be easier in the short term to find a community and just stick with it, there is something to be said for blazing your own trail, to thinking for yourself, to finding what works for you and keeping an open mind on something as essential as one of your core beliefs. So what do these three thinkers, these events, these happenings, mean to my life within the context of human health and nutrition? Did I immediately throw down my ways as a vegetarian, chase down a deer and eat it? No, I didn't. As I said, I still am primarily plant-based. But they did lead me to start asking different questions. And I would argue much, much more important questions, and to think about the nature of human nutrition much differently. Now, I acknowledge that my vegetarian dietary pattern, my way of eating, was coming not so much from an ethical perspective, not as much from an animal welfare standpoint, but from the perspective of optimal human health and what was working for me, my own story of health improvement. I fully get that the ethics around eating animals is much, much different. And we'll get into that a bit in this episode as well. But I don't want you to think that I don't get that the calculus is likely going to be much, much different. The question that I started grappling with is meat, is animal protein, quite literally the worst food that I or another human being could be eating. Forget whether meat might be healthy for a second, and slow down over there, Team Carnivore. But the important question that kept popping into my head is meat literally the worst? Because if it is the worst, and I think there are certainly some within the vegan and plant-based community who might think that, but I'd hazard a guess in saying that many within the plant-based community would accept that there are certainly worse things that a person could consume than meat, strictly from a health perspective, right? And again, we'll get into the ethics. But hear me out for a second. Of all of the foods or substances to rally against, to decry the dangers of eating, to consider as the root cause of diseases like cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and more, why meat? Why not Oreos or French fries? Why not cigarettes or beer? Why meat? And I didn't have a good answer to this. Actually, I did have a good answer to this. It just wasn't the answer that matched my identity. Which leads me to some thoughts for my plant-based friends, some summary thoughts for my vegan friends. Now, I'm not suggesting that meat is required to sustain a healthy human body. I don't believe it is. Many of the healthiest people that I know are vegans or vegetarians. I know. People out there screaming healthy user bias. I get it. I do. But I think it is quite clear that meat is certainly not the most toxic food a person could eat. We can make that statement as a minimum. If the goal is human health, as mine is simply avoiding meat the path to sustained health and longevity? More to the point, if we move away from meat and animal-based foods, but that comes with a move towards ultra-processed, highly industrialized foods, full of seed oils, fillers, and additives, is that really a step in the right direction? If you buy that diets like the Mediterranean diet, the Okinawan diet, or even the modern push in Japan, as we discussed in our episode on Ozempic, towards real whole foods, even with reduced meat consumption, have promoted long, healthy lifespans, as I believe that they have? Are those diets relatively low in animal-based protein, like beef, chicken, and eggs, etc.? Maybe. But what they're also incredibly low in, or maybe even feature none of, is ultra-processed foods. No 100-year-old centenarian in Okinawa, Greece, or Italy grew up eating the majority of their calories from Beyond Meat burgers or plant-based chicken fingers. Just didn't happen. And my strong suspicion is that if this trend of ultra-processed foods continues to be an implicit core or an increased core of a plant-based diet, whatever improved lifespan or health span that was once enjoyed by this group of people will be reversed. Real, fresh whole foods. That is the common theme in every group studied by Dr. Weston A. Price and also by every group featured in the Blue Zones. Real foods and seafoods. Why is this missing from all these conversations? I don't know. But if health is your driving force here, maybe chicken, beef, pork, maybe they'll never be your thing. All good. They aren't mine. But maybe seafood is. And again, I refer to Dr. Weston A. Price here. I also refer to the Mediterranean diet, the Okinawan diet. Low in animal protein? Maybe. But they do consume foods from the sea, right? Both animal foods and plant-based foods. Okay, now maybe seafood, still not your thing. All good. But maybe something ethically sourced, like eggs, butter, milk, maybe. There has never been an easier time in my lifetime to avoid industrially raised eggs, dairy, and butter. If your plant-based butter is full of seed oils, and let's be honest, most of them are, consider real, ethically sourced grass-fed butter, or just using olive oil. Nothing wrong with olive oil, used for thousands of years. No reason to sacrifice your own health just to avoid animal fats like butter. Now, maybe none of these options is acceptable. Maybe 100% plant-based is your last and final answer. Still good, still fine with me. Is it a wise idea to consider some selective supplements to ensure you're getting adequate levels of, say, iron, B vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins, etc.? Yeah, I believe so. Are there some exotic foods you might want to consider adding, like sea moss, algae, molasses? Yeah, of course. But again, if simply avoiding meat is what underpins your strategy for health and longevity, I will say this, and again, not medical advice, bro advice, friend advice. I think that that is incomplete. Okay, now I did say we would talk ethics, and so we've got to go there. This conversation would be woefully incomplete if we don't, so let's get into it. Now first, you may never find it ethically acceptable to consume another animal. It may not sit right with your morals. It may just feel icky. I get that. It's just a hard no. On a personal level, I can definitely respect that. I can definitely accept that. But I think we also have to accept that carnivores, certainly from the perspective of the animal kingdom, do and should exist. Should exist. We don't want to live in a world without carnivores, without omnivores. This is a world that is quickly overgrazed and overpopulated. Carnivores are essential. Now, whether you believe in something like a creator, intelligent design, or evolution, the importance of carnivores to the health of the planet is self-evident. Is it unethical for a lion to take a gazelle to feed and sustain her own body or that of her cubs? Is it wrong for a bear to catch and consume a wild salmon? Do we really want to live in a world without sharks, without dolphins? Well, of course not. Okay, now what about that of a hunter-gatherer in Tanzania, hunting and killing to feed his family? We may not like it. We may find it distasteful. But we have to admit that carnivores matter. They are essential. And if it's not wrong when an animal kills to feed its family, is it wrong for your fellow human? And again, I'm not advocating here. I'm not suggesting that you go out and hunt your next meal or go chow down on a massive steak for dinner. But I am encouraging, maybe humbly suggesting, that perhaps it would be better to accept there are many patterns of eating that can sustain human life. and that what might be right and what might feel right for one person may not feel right, may not be right for another. But I know, Norbie, have you seen the factory farms? Have you seen how the animals are treated? It is horrendous. This is a far, far cry from a hunter-gatherer quickly and painlessly dispatching an animal in the jungle. And on that point, I 100% agree. And it's time to talk to my carnivore friends. Of all the issues that should be at the forefront of your concern, I would humbly suggest that this should be it. Full freaking stop. The ethical treatment of animals, particularly those being raised for human consumption, should be wrestled from the death grip of plant-based PETA people and should be the thing talked about the most among carnivorous and omnivorous humans. Why? Well, first and foremost, for the obvious reason. You guys are the ones eating them. If you think that there is no difference in taste, nutrition, or impact to your health, whether the animal was allowed to graze freely out in the open as nature intended, or spent the entirety of its short, miserable life in a cage of its own feces, shoulder to shoulder with other terrified animals, pumped full of antibiotics and a cocktail of other drugs, just to allow it to survive long enough to meet the butcher's knife, you are wrong. If you've cut seed oils from your diet, yet you are out eating factory farmed meat, consider the feed given to those animals, these industrially raised cattle and chicken operations. All the things that you are trying to avoid, they are giving them to the animals. And as the saying goes, you are what you eat. Even setting aside your own health for a moment, because I get it, cost is a powerful driver. This is the most powerful argument against the broad acceptance of the dietary pattern that is working for you. Now, there are other arguments, maybe, but not like this. The end of this horrific treatment of animals for human and pet consumption should be high up on your list. And you might be thinking, it's not going to make a difference. It won't make a difference to people ethically. I will just tell you humbly, you are wrong. Consider the number of vegans who started eating eggs as the movement towards backyard chickens grew in popularity. I personally know many, and there's a reason for that. They could verify for themselves that the chickens were treated ethically, either by themselves personally or by someone that they trusted. Will there be some holdouts? Those who will never accept the eating of an animal by a human as being acceptable? Maybe. But this is a very, very small number of people. Many people are drawn to the plant-based movement due to the horrific images with respect to the terrible treatment of animals. Making progress on this issue will make a difference. Okay, and let's just talk diet, just for a moment. First, could it be possible that, quote, carnivore is merely a rest stop rather than a final destination? Let's consider the example of Dr. Paul Saladino, carnivore MD, full-on ketogenic carnivore. Now drinks milk, eats fruit and honey, and his health outcomes have improved. Even if we accept that humans can live on an all-meat diet, is that optimal? I will point out that while yes, it is true that Dr. Weston A. Price claimed to have found no evidence of those building and maintain bodies exclusively on plant-based foods, he also didn't find any evidence of those doing it exclusively on animal-based foods either. The closest you could argue is maybe the Maasai, or maybe the Inuit, depending on certain times of the year, where all they're able to get is essentially smoked salmon. But I'll point out that this was not by choice. These are areas of extreme weather. This was a condition imposed on nature, not selected by humans. And let's zoom in on something else. Nutrient deficiencies. Wait, are we talking about vegans again? No, I'm talking about carnivore nutrient deficiencies. Oh yes, there are many potential vitamin and mineral deficiencies that are possible if not accounted for on a carnivore diet. Iodine, folate, vitamin C, just to name a few. If you are exclusively or primarily eating muscle meat, consider operating as nature's carnivores do. They eat the organs first. Big cats, dogs, human hunter-gatherers, They eat the liver first. There's a reason for that. And while everything is protein, and muscle meat is good for that these days, the organs are way, way more nutrient dense. We've discussed this previously, but Dr. Price even points out that among some Native American groups he studied, the hunters only ate the organs, and they, quote, left the muscle meat to the dogs. Think about that for a second. To my knowledge, no group of hunter-gatherers, no group of traditional fishermen eats animals the way that modern humans typically do today, where we eat the muscle meat and we discard the rest. This is a mistake. Now, I know this is nothing new to many of those following a carnivore diet. The nose-to-tail concept is certainly an aspect that has grown in popularity. I do view this as a very good thing. And if you're on a carnivore diet, I would encourage you, humbly, again, no medical advice, just bro advice, I would strongly recommend considering experimenting with. Based on my own experience, learning from the experiences of many of the people mentioned in this episode, Dr. Paul Saladino, Chris Kresser, James Wilks, Dr. Weston A. Price, I don't believe that there is a singular optimal human diet. My own belief is that there are many patterns of eating that can promote incredible health and longevity. Nutrient-dense, powerful healing foods across the entire plant and animal kingdom. We don't all have to eat the same way. I'd argue that maybe we shouldn't all eat the same way. Now is an incredible time because people are questioning the conventional wisdom on food and nutrition. Rightfully so. I mean, the state of human health is abysmal. I am incredibly optimistic about the future of human health. But we get there by judging less and experimenting more, by studying the work of people like Dr. Weston A. Price, by studying cultures which have enjoyed incredible health and longevity, like the traditional Okinawans, like the Hadza, like the Catawbans, 3 incredible groups of humans that eat incredibly differently, but they all enjoy robust health and vitality. My main point in this episode is that in many ways, the diet wars, this fight over food, this fight over eating meat or not eating meat, has pointed us at the wrong enemy. I am convinced that from a health perspective, the true enemy of human health, the great Satan, if you will, it's not meat, it's not animal protein. I say this as primarily a plant-based guy. It is the ultra-processed foods that have emerged around the time of Dr. Weston A. Price and have been on a tear ever since. As we discussed in the Ozempic episode, these foods have directly led to metabolic dysfunction, obesity, and a whole host of other modern ailments. As I've said before, there's no medical advice here, just bro advice, just friend advice. We should take aim at the true enemy of human health, the foods that none of these groups, following a primarily animal-based diet or a primarily plant-based diet, had at the core of their diet. Ultra-processed foods. Are we going to get deep on this subject right now? No. This episode, like all the episodes, has gone way longer than anticipated. So if this idea is new, or if you're thinking, sure, yeah, but I don't eat much in the way of ultra-processed foods, you want to check out those prior episodes, episode number 9 and episode number 10, I believe. Okay, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up for today. Thank you for the listen. And of course, I'd love to have you as a subscriber. Won't cost you a thing, and you'll never miss an episode. But doing so will also help me build the show into what I know it can be. These topics are hugely important, maybe among the most important topics we have to think about as a species. And your support would really mean a lot to me. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.